You're listening to Wreathed in Disgrace, written by Robin Patchen, narrated by Brian and Matilda. Copyright 2022 by Robin Patchen. Audio copyright 2024 by Robin Patchen.
Chapter 1. Denise Masters watched from where she sat on a picnic table, not exactly afraid to approach, but not ready either. When she was a kid, this festival had consisted of a Christmas tree lighting ceremony, a snowball fight, if there was snow, and hot chocolate for the kids whose parents had been smart enough to bring a thermos. Coventry had changed over the last 8 years, maybe as much as Denise herself had. Christmas music carried across the park, blasting from speakers set up around the activity. On an ice skating rink, lovers twirled, toddlers wobbled, teenagers raced. Plenty of them landed on their rumps, usually laughing. Denise itched to show them how it was done. She'd been a good skater in her past life. She'd loved it, gliding across the ice like a bird in flight, the feel of the wind in her hair. She couldn't remember the last time she'd gone ice skating. Games had been set up throughout the grassy area: cornhole, horseshoes, giant Jenga. A couple of teens played volleyball on the sand, despite the fact that the weather wasn't exactly fit for the beach. Fortunately, the clouds weren't too thick, and the temperature hovered in the low 50s, warm for November in the New Hampshire mountains. There was a food truck, with the name of a local coffee shop emblazoned on the side. Denise would never have guessed that tiny Coventry could support a couple of restaurants and a coffee shop, much less a food truck. Santa Claus had come for the event and was chatting with little ones perched on his knee while a photographer snapped photos. The year before, Ella had scrambled onto Santa's lap. Would she now, or would she claim that, at 8.5, she was too mature for Santa? Denise hated that she had no idea. She hadn't seen her daughter since their month-long visit last summer, though she'd thought of her daily, hourly. Scanning the faces in the crowd, she caught sight of the first man she'd ever loved. Maybe, if she were honest, the only man she'd ever loved, even if her love had proved pretty paltry in the end. Not that she wanted Reed back. He loathed her. Sure, they'd come to a truce of sorts a couple of years before, but it had been a tenuous truce, quickly forgotten, when she demanded more time with Ella, and he argued that she deserved less. He'd agreed to a visitation schedule, but then tried repeatedly to wiggle out of it. He considered Ella his daughter, and he didn't like to share. And then Denise would threaten to get lawyers involved. And then they'd fight. The pattern had repeated more times than Denise wanted to count. She and her ex were cordial to each other now, only when Ella was nearby. Denise hoped to change that. Reed's pretty red-headed wife prompted not a twinge of jealousy. Jackie's parka was pulled snug around her middle. Either the slender woman had put on weight, or she was expecting. The second, no doubt. And nobody had bothered to tell Denise. Maybe they didn't think it was her business, but Ella was her business, even if Reed didn't want to admit it. That her stepmother was having a baby seemed like important information. Why hadn't Ella told her? Had Reed asked her not to? Where was Ella? Finally, Denise saw her daughter, and her heart flipped. She was proud of the girl her baby had become, with her dark brown hair so similar to Denise's, Reed's brown eyes, a spattering of freckles across her nose. She was proud of Ella's wide smile, her kindness, her contentment. Not that Denise could take credit for anything beyond the DNA. She loved Ella, loved her in a way she'd never known one person could love another. Those first few months after Ella's birth had been so hard, with depression suffocating her, coloring everything with a film of gray. Even then, Denise had loved Ella. Now, with the depression and the events that had chased her from New Hampshire so small in the rearview mirror, her love for Ella had only grown and expanded. And yet she'd left. What kind of mother leaves her baby? No wonder Reed hated her. No wonder the rest of Coventry wasn't proud to claim her as their own, at least not the people who'd really known her. Ella, precious, loving girl that she was, forgave Denise for her long absences from her life, but Reed never had and never would. And their old friends, most were only Reed's friends now. Love, pride, and shame. That was the cocktail that filled her stomach as she watched her daughter walk between her father and her stepmother, chattering like a squirrel and beaming with joy. Denise's daughter was always beaming with joy. Reed had raised her well. The happy family went to the little playground, and Ella climbed up on the swing and pumped. Ella was already halfway through her childhood, and, except for a few weeks here and there, Denise had missed it all. She'd achieved success, but every acting role, every award, every paycheck got lost in a haze of regret. If only she'd done everything differently. If only she'd told Reed the truth from the start. He believed, everybody believed, that she'd left Coventry, left him and Ella, because she'd wanted to chase her dream. She'd led them all to believe that because that was what she'd ended up doing, but it wasn't why she'd left. Now, what she wanted, all she wanted, was to be a part of Ella's life. If that meant she had to tell them all the truth, one step at a time. Right now, she needed to take literal steps. She hopped off the picnic table and started toward the crowd. "Father, give me the strength and courage." A loud bang reverberated across the water. She turned that direction in time to glimpse a boat speeding away. In November? Who would? She was tackled, hit the grass, face down, a man on top of her. Long-buried memories flashed, and she struggled to free herself, desperate to get away. She pushed at his arm propped beside her, but it didn't budge. She shifted, tried to get close enough to his wrist to bite him, but he moved to guard his skin and keep her in place. "Ma'am, I'm trying to protect you. Please stop." He hovered over her, not crushing her, but allowing enough pressure that she couldn't move. She got one leg free and whipped it back, catching flesh with her heel. "Oomph!" He lowered himself on top of her. "Stop fighting me!" The words were a demand, his voice deep and terrifying. A scream crawled up her throat, tried to claw its way out, but she couldn't seem to make any noise. "Ms. Masters." The man's voice was calm. "My name is John Donnelly. I'm a bodyguard. I'm trying to keep you alive." A bodyguard? What was he? "There's a shooter. Stay down." Shooter? She was still processing that when the man said, "He's gone." He popped off Denise, and she crawled away, desperate to put space between them. "Whoa, whoa! Stay here, ma'am." He grabbed her wrist. "Come on, let me help you up." Confused, she tried to get away, but he didn't let go. His grip was surprisingly gentle. She didn't have bodyguards, certainly not here. She was trying to remain incognito. "Ma'am." A blonde woman approached from the other side. "You need to go with Donnelly to the car. We have to get you out of here. My name is Lake. I'm his partner. There's been a credible threat, and somebody just took a shot." "Not at me!" Denise's voice was high, almost screeching. She lowered the pitch and started over. "That had nothing to do with me." There, that sounded better. "It was probably a hunter." "In town?" The man crowded her, too close. Was he trying to intimidate? "At a festival?" She tried to back away, but he gripped her other shoulder. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Just to be safe, we're going to protect you." He kept his voice level, though she heard a hint of frustration. "Please, come with me." She tore her gaze away from the strangers to look at the crowd just 100 yards distant. Was Ella all right? It seemed the music was loud enough that nobody had heard the shot, or if they had, they discounted it as inconsequential. Written it off as a car backfiring, or maybe a firecracker somewhere. A few people were staring toward the lake, but most had returned to their activities. People still skated on the rink, still stood in line at the food truck. Ella still swung in the playground, safe, thank God. Reed was looking Denise's direction, though. Did he see her? This was not how she'd wanted the day to go. This was exactly the opposite of what Denise had planned. As long as Ella was safe. That was all that mattered. "Ma'am," the bodyguard said, "we need to go." This was crazy. Was Denise in danger? Had somebody taken a shot at her? Just a few 100 feet from her daughter? "Come on!" He wrapped an arm around her back and started walking. Denise was too stunned to argue. She let herself be led across the grass. He didn't walk toward her Tesla, though. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said. He didn't falter or slow, just continued in the same direction. "Where's the woman you were with?" Denise asked. "Talking to the police." "Sure she is. Let me go." The man didn't comply until they'd crossed the street and reached an ice cream shop. Despite the cold temperature, people stood in line at the counter inside. When Denise and her assailant, or bodyguard, or whatever he was, stood beside the brick building, he situated himself between her and the lake, either to protect her or to hide her from somebody who might rescue her. She figured the odds were 50-50. He angled to point back toward the park, where the tall blonde was indeed having a conversation with a uniformed police officer. She waved toward the water, and the cop spoke into the little microphone on his jacket, then jogged away. "See?" The man let her go and lifted both arms. "I'm just trying to keep you alive." He shoved a hand in his back pocket and came out with a leather case, which he opened to show her a private investigator license from Massachusetts. "Take a picture of it and send it to somebody who loves you, somebody who'll check to make sure you get home safely. Do it now." His voice was deep and commanding. "You have 10 seconds, and then you're getting into my SUV." "Who hired you?" "Bruce Taggart, Denise's agent." She should have guessed. She pulled her phone from her jacket pocket, snapped a photo of the man and another of his ID. Then she walked to the rear of his vehicle. He kept in step with her the whole way, blocking her from the park and lake, and snapped a photo of the license plate. "In the back." "My car." "We'll take care of it." "Your partner." "Get in the vehicle, please." It was insane. She didn't know this person, had never seen him before, but it would be just like Bruce to hire security for her against her wishes and without her knowledge. The man opened the rear door of the Lincoln Navigator, and she slid inside. She selected the 3 photos on her phone. He'd told her to send them to somebody who loved her. There were her parents and Ella. Obviously, she wouldn't send the information to an 8-year-old. Denise's parents were in Florida. She'd caused them enough worry. She could send the pictures to one of her church friends, but they were in LA. They had lives and families, better things to do than worry about her. She could send them to Monroe, her house sitter, someone else she'd met at church. But though he was a friend, she wasn't sure she wanted him quite that involved in her business. She sent the photos to Bruce. Her agent might not love her, but he could be trusted, and he had a vested interest in keeping her safe. Plus, he was always available. She tapped out a text. "If you didn't hire this guy, then I'm being abducted." The bodyguard sat in the front seat, slammed the door, and started the car, but he didn't move. If he was abducting her, he was sure taking his time about it. "Are we going somewhere?" she asked. "Waiting for Lake." "Lake? What kind of a name?" Denise's phone vibrated, and she read Bruce's response. "I hired him." "Why?" "Call me when you're safe and I'll explain." He'd better. She'd left Hollywood to escape the craziness. The last thing she wanted was for the craziness to follow her home. "You want Lake to drive your car?" the man asked. "Or do you want to leave it here?" "I'll drive it." She reached for the door handle, but he locked the doors. She tried to disengage hers, but it was a child safety lock. "Sorry, ma'am, after we get you home, we'll discuss what to do next. For now, you're going to have to trust me." Trust him? She didn't even know him. Before she could say that, the passenger door opened and the blonde slid in. "Cops are searching for the driver of the boat. So far, nobody knows anything." He turned to Denise. "Keys?" It seemed she had no choice. Typical. She had all the money she could ever want, but money didn't buy the things she desired most. Like her daughter's affection. Like the freedom to go to a small-town Christmas lighting ceremony without bringing chaos with her. Whatever. She pulled the keys from her pocket and handed them over the seat to the blonde. "See you at the house." She stepped out and jogged away. The man shifted gears and pulled onto the street that ringed the lake. Denise stared at the crowd as they passed it. If she'd had any doubt that Reed had seen her before, the way he was watching the SUV now confirmed her worry. He looked furious. Of course. All the courage it had taken her to show up here, to walk toward the crowd, to try to fit in with her old friends. And this was how it turned out? I'm sorry I frightened you. The bodyguard stopped at the intersection and met her eyes in the rearview mirror. I hope I didn't hurt you. She did a quick survey and was surprised to find she didn't feel a single ache. Cold, sure. The grass had been damp, but he'd somehow managed to tackle her without causing injury. She had the vague memory of the man's arm around her middle when he'd taken her down. He'd supported her and protected her. Maybe she could trust him. His eyes narrowed. They were gray and serious beneath dark brown eyebrows. Are you hurt? Was she? She didn't think so. What is your name? Donley. John Donley. Okay. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to say now. If somebody really had taken a shot at her, he'd likely saved her life. But she didn't want to believe anybody had been trying to kill her. In which case, this guy had ruined her plans. You didn't hurt me, John. Scared me, but didn't hurt me. He nodded and turned onto Main Street, leaving Ella, Denise's ex, her old friends, and maybe a killer behind.
Chapter 2. The sound of the gunshot reverberated in his head. John replayed the moment as he drove through Coventry toward Ms. Masters' house. He and Lake had been told she drove a red Tesla, not exactly a dime a dozen in central New Hampshire. So when they'd seen the car driving the opposite direction on Rattlesnake Road as they'd headed toward her house, they'd done a U-turn and followed. They didn't generally stalk their clients from afar, but the man who hired them had asked that they keep an eye on her without letting her know for the time being. John wouldn't have agreed, but Bartlett hadn't consulted him. Apparently, Denise Masters didn't think she needed protection in her hometown. That gunshot said differently. He'd heard enough rifle fire to recognize the sound instantly. He and Lake had snapped into action. John had sprinted across the grass and tackled the client, trying not to hurt her. Lake had followed but kept her eyes toward the threat. The boat had taken off before Lake could make out many markings, information she'd relayed through the earpiece that connected them. The local police were already investigating. In the back seat, Denise Masters' eyes were wide, flicking from one window to the next. She was afraid, rightfully so, but she didn't seem to be in shock. She'd called him John. Nobody but his parents called him John. It was Donley, always Donley. But for some reason, he hadn't corrected her. He would when she was safe. He was making a right on Rattlesnake Road before she spoke. How do you know where I live? Mr. Taggart, how long have you been watching me? We just got to town an hour ago. We were headed this way earlier when we saw you driving down the mountain. He let his gaze skim the surroundings. Trees towered on the left, where the slope climbed higher. A steep drop-off edged the other side of the road. Between trunks and bare branches, he saw the lake below. Though the skies were gray, the world mostly colorless, he remembered the beauty of the small town from when he'd been here the previous summer, protecting Josie Smith, a senator's daughter. Josie had almost died because of John's incompetence. Although nobody else labeled what happened the same way, John should have been prepared. He should have insisted on more bodyguards. There were a lot of things he should have done differently and hadn't because he'd elevated pleasing his client over doing what he thought was best. He wouldn't make that mistake again. Ms. Masters remained silent in the back seat, and John managed not to look at her again. Though there was something magnetic about her thick brown hair, those striking blue eyes. Her skin was darker than his, though naturally or from the sun. He wasn't sure. Of course, he'd already known she was beautiful. Every man with eyes knew that. His sister had 2 sons, and he'd watched all the latest superhero movies with them. It was his way of connecting with his nephews, and it gave his sister and brother-in-law some time alone. Denise Masters had been in a lot of those movies. Most of the time, her character, Ember Flair, was a supporting character, though she'd been the star of one. She was a good actor, but he'd have guessed she wasn't as pretty in person as she was on the screen. Wrong. She was prettier in person, maybe because her face was clear of makeup. She had freckles across the bridge of her nose he'd never seen on the big screen. Her hair wasn't all fancied up like it was in the movies. It was long and wavy, windblown from her time at the lake. Nobody would confuse Denise Masters with the girl next door. She was gorgeous and tough. When he'd tackled her, she'd fought like crazy. If he hadn't shifted, she'd have clamped her teeth down on his wrist. And somehow she'd gotten in a good kick to his thigh. Impressive flexibility. Hopefully, he'd hidden his sudden, shocking flash of attraction. Not that it would be all that shocking to Denise Masters. She was probably accustomed to being drooled over. He needed to stop thinking of her as Denise Masters, movie star. She was a client, just another client. They passed a condo development, then nothing for miles until they finally reached her driveway. He did a quick scan. No cameras, no gate, no obvious security of any kind. He'd fix that immediately. He parked and heard his client yank the door handle again, to no avail. "Ma'am, let's wait for Lake. She'll be here any minute and clear the house." "I don't appreciate being locked in the car." "Yes, ma'am." A moment passed and then the woman sighed. "Will you please unlock the doors?" Heavy sarcasm on the please. "No, ma'am. We're going to wait for Lake to clear the house." "Stop calling me ma'am. Makes me feel old." "Yes, ma'am." He clamped his lips shut. "So I'm locked in." Irritation spiked and he forced a calm tone. "Somebody shot at you." He glanced at his watch. 27 minutes ago. That person could have docked the boat, gotten into a car, and driven up here. He could be waiting for you right now. And we're sitting ducks." He knocked on the window. "Bulletproof glass." She glared at him in the rearview mirror. Before she could formulate a scathing reply, Lake turned the red Tesla into the driveway and parked. Through his earpiece, she said, "I have the keys. I'll clear the house." He pressed the button on the two-way attached to his hip. "Be alert." "Isn't that your job?" Ms. Masters asked. He let go of the button. "Talking to my partner. She's going inside your house. We'll follow when we know it's safe." Lake jogged up the walk and steps to the front door, where she bent to scoop something off the porch before letting herself inside with Denise's keys. "No alarm," Lake said. "What if I don't want her inside my house?" Ms. Masters asked. He shifted to face her. "We've been hired to protect you. If you don't want our protection, then we'll leave. But before you make that decision, you need all the information." "What information don't I have?" "When we get inside, what else do we have to do besides talk?" He faced forward again. The guy who'd hired them, Taggart, was supposed to have sent some documents that would explain his decision to hire bodyguards. Maybe those documents would convince Miss Masters that she needed protection. If that didn't work, and if getting shot at didn't convince her, then he and Lake would head back to Boston. They weren't about to intrude where they weren't wanted. Rather than explain all of that, he said, "We'll discuss it when we get inside." Ms. Masters huffed but said nothing else. Minutes passed before Lake spoke in his ear again. "All clear. On our way." He climbed out and opened the rear door, gaze skimming the area all around the house. It was secluded, but that didn't make it safe. Ms. Masters stepped out, and he stayed right behind her up the walk. After she climbed the 3 steps to the door, she looked over her shoulder at him. "Could you back off?" "When you're inside." The woman sighed and pushed her way into the house. He half hoped she'd refuse protection. The only thing worse than guarding prima donnas was guarding prima donnas who didn't think they needed to be guarded. He'd had his share of assignments like that, and he didn't relish another. But the memory of that gunshot, unlike most prima donnas, Miss Masters seemed to legitimately be in danger. So as unpleasant as this was proving to be, he'd stick around until the threat was secured or she sent them away, no matter how difficult she was.
Chapter 3. This was supposed to be Denise's refuge from the storm. After viewing photos online, she'd bought the house the previous summer and planned to visit as soon as she completed the obligations that came with her latest movie. Meanwhile, she'd hired a decorator and had a pool and guest house built in the backyard. It had taken her longer to visit than she'd hoped. Fine. If she were honest with herself, she'd admit it had taken longer to build up her courage than it had to build the guest house. As much as she craved her daughter's company, she knew what Reed believed about her, and deep down, she feared he was right. He'd told her often enough, both in words and attitude, that she was a terrible mother, that she could only bring her daughter pain and hardship. Would more time with Ella further highlight Denise's deficiencies? Could she offer her daughter anything but trouble? It was easier to stay in California and dream of what life could be like back in New Hampshire than to come here and deal with the truth. So maybe she'd manufactured a whole bunch of obligations that had been more like excuses. But she was here now, in this house she'd hoped would be a sanctuary. She crossed the great room toward the kitchen. The bodyguard followed, not as close as he'd been outside. The man needed to learn the meaning of the term personal space. The one who looked like some kind of blonde Amazon warrior walked toward her from her place near the rear French doors. "Ms. Masters, I'm sorry we didn't get a better introduction. My name is Lake." She neared Denise and held out her hand. Denise gripped it. "Lake what?" "Just Lake, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am," she added. "Please," as an afterthought. "What's your first name?" The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "I go by Lake." "Fine. If the woman wanted to be known as a body of water, more power to her." Denise continued into the kitchen. "I'm freezing." She'd already been chilly, and getting tackled into damp grass hadn't helped. If not for the unexpected company, she'd change into her cozy, velveteen loungewear. "I'm having some tea. You two want any?" Lake shook her head. Behind Denise, John said, "No thank you." After she turned on the electric kettle, Denise busied herself finding a mug. They were here somewhere. Her decorator had outfitted the place with everything Denise thought she'd need, including bedding, towels, dishes, and appliances. When she'd finally built up the courage to visit, she'd called the company that managed the house and had them stock her fridge and pantry. Since arriving the night before, she hadn't familiarized herself with where everything was. While the kettle hissed and bubbled, she yanked open cabinets and found what she needed. All the mugs were gray, like pretty much everything else in the space. The bones of the house were beautiful, but the decor was all sophistication and understated elegance. In other words, blah. "There was a package for you on the front stoop." Lake nodded to a manila envelope on the kitchen table. "Mr. Taggart told our boss he would have some information sent to you. I suspect that's it." "Information that explained the bodyguards," Denise assumed. She'd deal with that when she warmed up. She poured steaming water over the teabag, and the aroma of Earl Grey rose into the room while she added honey and stirred. "You two sure you don't want any?" Neither responded. Bad enough these people were in her house. Would it kill them to pretend to be normal? The hot, fragrant tea soothed her. She'd been in California too long and wasn't accustomed to New England weather. She'd reacclimate, staying through the holidays, maybe longer. Maybe forever. Assuming she didn't screw everything up. John and Lake were both watching her as if she were on stage. She was used to that in public, but this was her home, even if it didn't look like it. Or feel like it. She wanted nothing more than to send them both away, but that manila envelope needed to be opened and dealt with. Bruce wouldn't have hired bodyguards, against her expressed will, without a very good reason. So, fine. She was on her way to the offending mail when somebody knocked. John's gaze snapped to hers. "You expecting—" "No." He crossed the living room and spoke through the door. "Who is it?" "Detective Pollard, Coventry PD." John opened the door and ushered the older man inside. The detective wasn't short, but John dwarfed him. Pollard had dark brown hair and nondescript hazel eyes in a pudgy face. He looked eager as he crossed the room toward Denise, hand outstretched. "Detective Paul Pollard, ma'am." She smiled, shaking his hand, which was as oversized as his face, and sweaty. The temperature had probably dropped to the 30s, and this guy had sweaty hands. "Nice to meet you, detective." "Been assigned to the shooting." "Oh. Well, maybe somebody fired a weapon, but it wasn't at me." "'Fraid it was. We dug a bullet out of a tree just a few feet from where you were standing. According to your guards, anyway." His gaze skimmed past Denise for a moment, and he nodded at Lake. "You're saying somebody really was trying to shoot me?" Denise's words were laced with shock, too high and too loud. She'd been so sure the bodyguards had overreacted. But the detective's head wagged back and forth. Maybe somebody was trying to scare you." Beside them, John said, "Anything on the bullet?" "We'll send it for analysis, but it'll take some time." He faced Denise again. "Anybody in town have a grudge against you?" "I can't think of anybody." Except Reed, but as much as he hated her, he wouldn't hurt her. And anyway, he'd been at the park. "You think the person fired from the boat?" No question. Any info on that front? John asked. Possibly. He pulled a little notebook from his jacket pocket and flipped it open. Witnesses say it was a fishing boat with a red stripe down the side. Is that what you saw? John nodded. It looked well worn. One occupant, a man. He wore a knit cap and a sweatshirt, dark green. Couldn't see below the waist. Headed to the northeast. He turned to Lake. Anything to add? He fired once, then took off at a good clip. He was around the bend and out of sight in seconds. The detective looked at Denise. What did you see? I have nothing to add. My focus was elsewhere. Assuming this was aimed at you specifically and not random, Pollard said. Any ideas who could have done it? None. Who knew you'd be at the tree lighting ceremony today? Denise shook her head. I hadn't told anybody my plans. Nobody even knows I'm here. The man's eyes scrunched, wrinkling the space between his eyebrows. You're sure? No friends, family? He indicated the bodyguards. These two? I've never seen them before today. John explained who hired them and how they'd come to be at the lake. Okay, Pollard said. So you're saying... He turned to Denise. Your agent thinks you're in danger? Not exactly, Denise said. Yes, John said. The cop looked between them before focusing on Denise again. You're saying nobody knew you were in town? Bruce, my house sitter in L.A., and the company that manages the house when I'm not here, Rossi Properties. They turned on the heat and bought groceries. Pollard wrote that down. I'll start with Rossi Properties. He slid his notebook back into his pocket. Unless the guy firing at you was a terrible shot, which is possible, I'd guess he was just trying to scare you. Maybe it was a kid playing a prank who didn't even realize who he was shooting at. But until we know for sure, I recommend you be careful. We wouldn't want anything to happen to you. His cheeks turned a little pink as he said the last sentence. Thank you, Detective. John started for the front door. You have my number and my partner's. You'll let us know what you learn? The detective seemed in no hurry to leave, but he walked beside the bodyguard. Yeah, and you too. He turned to focus on Denise. If anything else happens, or if you think of anyone who might want you to leave town, I'll call you. The detective walked out, and John closed and locked the door behind him. This was crazy. Somebody had actually shot at her, and her daughter had been 50, maybe 75 yards away, not to mention the hundreds of other people who'd been in the park today. It was horrifying. She sipped the tea, trying to warm a chill caused by more than just the temperature. But as long as she was dealing with bad news, she snatched the oversized envelope and tried to tear open the end. It had practically been laminated in packaging tape. Let me! John stepped forward, holding one of those red pocket knives with a million tools. She handed him the envelope, and he sliced open the end and handed it back. She shook a thick stack of papers into her hand. The one on top was a printout from the LA Times, an article about the latest high-profile killing. Why would Bruce send her this? It wasn't as if she didn't know about the murdered female actors. Heck, that was one of the reasons she'd finally decided to return to New Hampshire. Not that she feared being a victim, not really. There were thousands of actors in Hollywood. Why would she be a target? That was the problem, though. Nobody could figure out how the victims were related. Aside from all being female actors, they had nothing in common, nothing that any authorities could determine anyway. At least according to the media, but maybe the police were holding back information. The first victim had starred in a sitcom that aired for a few years on some cable channel. Denise had never seen it, nor had she ever met the woman. She'd never met any of the victims. That page was stapled to a few more. The rest of the article, it looked like. Denise flipped to the next bundle. It was an article about the second murdered actor, a woman who'd played a detective in a long-running TV series. Moving on to the third stapled bundle, she saw an article about the third victim. Denise wasn't the brightest bulb in the stage lights, but she was sensing a pattern. Why had her agent sent her this? She lifted the larger envelope again and looked inside, hoping for an explanation. One slip of paper hadn't come out with the rest. This package was delivered to my office for you. I called the police, and they took the originals. This is a copy. Call me. Bruce. Lake had returned to her spot near the rear doors, but John leaned in to see. Articles about the starlet slayings? Starlet slayings. Some reporter had coined the moniker, and it had stuck. That was sent to you? The guard asked. To my agent. She didn't look at him. Probably just somebody trying to freak me out. He made a sound low in his throat. You'd better call Mr. Taggart. I'm sure it's nothing. He's just being paranoid. Except Bruce wouldn't have forwarded this if he didn't think she had reason to worry. She glanced at the bodyguard, who was giving her a look she guessed was a combination of impatience and annoyance. Similar to a look he'd given her in the car. He had to know who she was. Seemed he wasn't impressed. She dialed, and Bruce answered immediately. Did you get the package? I don't understand what the big deal is. So somebody sent me articles about the victims. What difference? Did you look through it? Bruce's normally low voice pitched higher when he was upset. Like now. You need to look through the whole thing. Okay. She scanned each printout, trying to figure out what the point was. John hovered over her shoulder to see what she was seeing. Hold on, Bruce. She set her cell on the table. You're on speaker. The bodyguards are here as well. Good, good, Bruce said. Denise, go to the bottom of the pile. She lifted the stack, leaving the last bundle of papers on the table, and stared at the image. This woman she knew, an A-lister known for her roles in romantic comedies. Shannon Butler wasn't a friend exactly, but Denise had met her and liked her. They'd connected at parties. They had mutual acquaintances. But Shannon wasn't one of the killer's victims, and this wasn't an article about a murder. It was a puff piece about Shannon's work with some charity. I'm confused, Denise said. What does Shannon have to do with anything? You haven't heard? She got that acid drop feeling in her middle. She hadn't looked at the news that morning. This house of hers was so secluded, so peaceful. The last thing she'd wanted was to let the world intrude. She didn't want to know. She didn't want to hear what Bruce was about to say. His voice was lower than usual when he spoke. What you have is a copy of a packet that was left leaning against the agency's back door at some point between Wednesday evening, when we closed for Thanksgiving, and this morning, when I went in to get some work done. Maybe it came today. If you didn't see it until this morning, John asked, how did you get it here so fast? Courier, Denise said. John's eyebrows hiked, but she paid little attention. When Bruce wanted something done, it got done, and obviously this was too important to toss in the mail. She figured there'd been a local attorney in the middle, someone paid well for confidentiality. Her agent continued, maybe the package came last night or the night before, and if it did, if I'd seen it sooner. Bruce was a tough guy, an old-school Hollywood agent, the kind who wasn't against raising his voice and dropping threats as liberally as he dropped profanities. When his voice broke, tears pricked Denise's eyes. John pulled out a kitchen chair and motioned her into it. She sat, dreading what her agent would say next. Shannon Butler was murdered last night. Denise couldn't comprehend what was happening. John spoke into the silence. The killer sent that package before he pulled off the murder. He wanted you to know who his next victim would be. Before Denise could speak, Bruce said, That's the theory. Cameras? John asked. Not in the back, Bruce said. Only employees use that entrance. The bodyguard wore a scowl when he turned to her. Why you? She couldn't speak for the emotion clogging her throat. She shook her head. Maybe it's, like a John Hinckley thing, Bruce said. You know, the guy who tried to kill Ronald Reagan to impress Jodie Foster? Denise knew the story. Surely somebody wouldn't murder. How many women so far? 7? 8? Surely somebody wouldn't do that to get Denise's attention. She'd had her share of crazy fans, no question about it. But a murderer? What did the police say? Denise asked. They're looking for connections from these women to you. They're going to call you as soon as I give them your number. I wanted to break the news to you myself. There are no connections, Denise said. I knew Shannon, but it wasn't like we were friends. We never worked together. And the other victims. I don't think I ever met any of them. The pitch of her voice was rising with her panic. What does any of this have to do with me? I don't know. Bruce cleared his throat. Just stay safe, okay? Do what your bodyguards tell you. Make sure you have top-notch security at your house. Can you do that? Yeah, I guess. I gotta call the detective. He'll be reaching out, so answer it, all right? The sooner we get to the bottom of this, the better. When Bruce ended the call, she stared at her cell phone as if it might have the answers she needed. She didn't understand. What did the starlet slangs have to do with her? Why would the killer send her the information? If somebody had opened that envelope sooner, Shannon might have been warned. She might have been saved. The murders had nothing to do with Denise. Nothing. It seemed the killer thought differently. Are you convinced now that you need us? Denise forced her gaze up to the bodyguard beside her. She wanted so badly for the answer to be no. No, she didn't need bodyguards. No, she wasn't in danger, but she wasn't stupid. She nodded. We have some ground rules. She'd worked with bodyguards before and was accustomed to their rules. They always wanted to go over them. Okay. We're here to protect you. Our whole job is to make sure you're safe. If we tell you to do something, we're telling you for a reason that involves your safety. Makes sense. So if I tell you to duck, you duck. If I tell you to run, you run. If I tell you to stay, you stay. Like a well-trained dog. If he thought her funny or annoying, his facial expression didn't give him away. You need to obey us. If you say jump, I ask how high. No. The single word was sharp. If I say jump, you jump. No questions asked. Can you do that? I can try. There is no try. Thank you, Yoda. His lips didn't even quirk. And I'll be bringing in a larger team to protect you. What if I don't want a larger team? Only the slight narrowing of his eyes gave away his frustration. Then you can find another agency. Wow, demanding much? When he didn't respond, she sighed. Do what you think is best, and I'll obey your every order. Thank you, ma'am. As long as you quit calling me ma'am. I'll try. She raised one eyebrow, and he almost smiled. Yeah, I know. There is no try. He motioned to the packet of papers. Do you mind? While John read the newspaper articles, Denise stared at the phone, sipping her cooling tea and waiting for the California police to call. In the minutes since she'd spoken to Bruce, everything had changed. Someone banged on the front door. She gasped and pressed her hand against her chest, her heart pounding beneath her palm. Was the detective back? He'd knocked like a normal person, though, not like an enraged gorilla. The bodyguards moved like performers in a choreographed dance. Lake shifted back to the slider and glanced outside. Her hand rested on the firearm at her hip. Outside, the sun had already dipped below the tree line. John crossed to the front door, also seemingly primed to draw his weapon. Who is it? Reed Coate. And here she'd thought the day couldn't get any worse. John turned to her, eyebrows lifted. My ex-husband. Open up or send him away, the guard asked. This wasn't how she'd wanted to do this. She'd planned to let Reed in on her plans slowly, carefully, to mitigate his reaction. But nothing had gone according to plan so far, so why was she surprised he'd found her? She stood. Let him in. John opened the door, and Reed stormed past it. He was tall and slender, and still handsome, despite the scowl on his face. When they'd been together 1,000,000 years ago, his eyes had often been filled with amusement, always with love when he looked at her. Now, those same eyes conveyed anger as his gaze bounced off John and landed on her. But before he said anything, he snapped back to the guard. I know you. How do I? He studied John's face a long moment, then looked past Denise to Lake on the far end of the great room. After a beat, he glared at Denise, taking a few steps toward where she stood beside the kitchen table. You have bodyguards? How did he know? Before she could ask, Reed said, Why do you need? What are you doing here, Reed? Denise kept her voice level despite his rudeness. How did you? What am I doing here? I live here. What are you doing here? I live here too. The words had the desired effect. Horror flicked across his face. Lovely greeting from the man who'd once sworn to love her till death parted them. Not that she could blame him. He looked around at the space again. The front part of the great room sported a cathedral ceiling with a stone fireplace that reached to the peak. Soft white sofas were flanked by gray end tables that matched the coffee table. Just inside the front door, stairs led to a second-floor hallway that was visible from the ground floor, beneath which were her kitchen and dining area. The only interesting thing in the room, besides the grand fireplace, was the undecorated Christmas tree the management company had put up for her. 12 feet tall, it stood against the wall between the living area and the kitchen. She hoped Ella could help her decorate it. The house had been built in the 60s, or maybe the 70s, but had been completely remodeled earlier that year. And if it was a little bland, despite the preferences she'd given to the overpriced decorator, she'd add her own personal touches over time. Reed's face turned a shade of red that rivaled that of an heirloom tomato. Bright red with hints of purple. If she didn't know better, she'd think he was suffering a heart attack. But no, this was just Reed being Reed. He spent his life perpetually enraged at Denise. He started toward her again, but John grabbed his arm. He must have held tightly because Reed tried to twist out of his grip and failed. "Call off your dog," he said through gritted teeth. "Sir!" If John was offended, it didn't come out in his voice, which was even, though a little cool. "It's my job to protect Ms. Masters. In your current state, I suggest you keep your distance." Reed shot her another hateful look. "Fine." John released Reed's arm, and he shook it out. "How did you know where I was?" Denise asked. "Saw you get into the SUV. Then I saw the Tesla drive off and figured it was yours. Nobody else in town is that pretentious." He'd been in her house 30 whole seconds before he'd insulted her. A personal record. "I lost it on Rattlesnake," Reed said, "but I knew you wouldn't be in one of the condos. When I saw the Tesla in the driveway, I made some calls. You bought this place?" "Who did you call?" Denise had purchased the house through a corporation set up to protect her. How could Reed have figured it out so quickly? "The former owner is a friend of mine," he said. Aspen dug into her paperwork from the closing. She said it was bought by EMC and Son. I cracked the code. EMC, Ella Marie Coate. And Son, as in Masterson, Denise's maiden name. "Why are you here, Reed?" He stood taller. "This is my town, Denise. It's not like you got Coventry in the divorce. I grew up here too. As far as I know, it's still a free country. I can live wherever I want." "Not here," he said. She was about to toss out a retort. How he had no right to tell her where to live. How he was lucky she hadn't sued for custody of their daughter yet. Instead, she tried very hard to see this from his perspective. He'd raised Ella by himself. He was her custodial parent, her real parent in every sense of the word. Denise had left them both, and Reed didn't understand why. Nobody did. That was her fault, not Reed's. Denise had rights she hadn't pressed for. Her presence had to feel threatening, which was why she'd hoped to ease into this slowly. Summoning all her acting skills, she let a smile fill her face and chose a non-threatening tone of voice. "I'm not here to ruin your life, Reed." "Why are you here then?" "Because I want more time with my daughter. Not vacations, but real, everyday life kind of time." "You aren't capable of that." His words sounded so final, so confident, so true. "Maybe I'll surprise you." "Remind me not to hold my breath." She deserved his contempt. She'd messed up everything. But God had forgiven her. Ella had forgiven her. According to Ella, Reed and Jackie attended church every Sunday, but he couldn't seem to manage the forgiveness thing where she was concerned. "I hope, if Ella ever disappoints you, you'll show her more mercy than you've shown me." "You don't deserve mercy." "I don't think that word means what you think it means." If he recognized the reference from The Princess Bride, a movie they'd watched repeatedly in high school, he didn't show it. He crossed his arms and glanced at the bodyguards again. "What's going on? Do you always travel with bodyguards? Or is there something—" He stepped forward a few steps. John stayed beside him, crowding Reed like he'd crowded Denise earlier. He kept his gaze on Denise, maybe waiting for some signal that he should stop him from getting too close. She didn't want Reed to know what was going on. He'd only use the knowledge against her, use it to keep her from Ella. But he was Ella's father. If Denise wanted a real place in her daughter's life, she and Reed would need to find a way to work together. Reed reached the kitchen table and peered at the papers spread out there. "These are the Starlit Slayer's victims. Why do you have—" He rounded on Denise. "Are you a target?" Was that concern in his voice? "I have no reason to believe—" "You're a target, and you came to Coventry, where your daughter lives?" He moved toward her, but John stepped in the way. John's body was just inches from hers as he stood between them. His back was broad, his shoulders wide and strong. Reed glared past the man at her. "Seriously?" "It's okay, John." Near the back door, Lake's eyebrows hiked in surprise. At what? Did she think Denise should be afraid of her ex? Reed wasn't dangerous. Denise patted the man's back. "Reed won't hurt me. It's okay." The muscles beneath her hand tensed, but the bodyguard stepped out of the way silently. He stopped just a few feet from her, poised, it seemed, to jump between them again. Reed tempered his voice. "Will you please tell me what's going on? I told you I wanted to buy a house here to be closer to Ella. And then you didn't. I thought it was a passing whim. I've been busy with contractual obligations, filming, interviews, tours. You know." He didn't look impressed. Not that she'd expected him to be. "My contract is up at the end of the year. The studio's trying to renew it. My agent is working on that. Meanwhile, I had time on my hands. I bought the house this summer, got it ready, and now I'm here. For how long? I don't know exactly. Through the holidays for sure. Maybe longer. Maybe forever." But she didn't tell him that. One step at a time. His eyes narrowed. Does Ella know? Did he suspect their daughter had kept it from him? Would she have, if Denise had asked her to? "I would never ask her to keep something like that from you." He blinked, glanced away. "Unlike you," she said. "When were you going to tell me Jackie's pregnant?" "How is that any of your business? That my daughter's about to get a baby sister or brother? Kind of a big thing in a kid's life. Seems she might want to talk to her mother about it." "She doesn't need you. She has Jackie." Denise absorbed the blow the same way she'd absorbed all of Reed's hits for years. "Nevertheless," Denise kept her voice even, "I am her mother. It's not kind of you to ask her to keep things from me. That puts her in a very awkward position, don't you think?" He pressed his lips together, ran his hand over his short hair. "Yeah, you're right." "Whoa, just like that?" "And about the other thing," he said. "The whole mercy thing. I'm usually pretty good at it. Forgiveness. But with you—" She didn't expect him to finish the sentence. He didn't need to. She snatched her mug from the kitchen table and moved around the island into the kitchen. "Would you like a cup of tea?" "No thanks." "John? Lake?" "No, ma'am," Lake said. Denise speared her with a look. "Habit, sorry." Denise poured out the cold Earl Grey, grabbed another tea bag, herbal with hints of cinnamon and cloves, and poured the still hot water over it. "I came here to be near Ella." She added honey to the mug before looking at Reed. "Did the murders have something to do with me making the decision now?" "Maybe. I mean, I wasn't nervous. Not really. But, yeah, it's a little disconcerting to have women in the same line of work as mine be murdered. I honestly didn't think they had anything to do with me." "You didn't think, but now you do?" She indicated the table with her chin. "Somebody sent me that packet of papers with articles about the murders. The last one is the victim who was killed last night, Shannon Butler, I saw. It's possible," she placed heavy emphasis on that word, "that the packet was left for me with my agent before Shannon was killed, meaning it's possible that the killer left it. But it's just as likely the packet was left this morning." The color in Reed's face had returned to normal. Now it paled. "You're saying maybe the killer sent it to you?" "Maybe. But I didn't know about any of that when I came here. That all happened today. How long have you been here? Since last night. Why were you stalking us at the festival today? She plopped the mug on the counter, spilling a little across the white marble. I wasn't stalking you, Reed. I was trying to get up my courage to join you. Join Cassidy and James. Can you understand that? Can you understand that it's not easy for me to be back here? I knew how you'd react. I thought Ella would be happy to see me, but everybody else. Maybe the slightest tinge of compassion flitted across his face, but it didn't last. You thought you'd just show up, no warning. A surprise? He let that settle. Ella would have liked that. The admission seemed to hurt. I'm glad she didn't see you. It would break her heart to have you show up and then leave again. I'm not going anywhere. You might be in danger. You really want to bring that danger to your daughter's doorstep? John cleared his throat. There's no reason to believe the girl is. She's not your daughter, Reed snapped. To Denise, he said, you need to go back to Beverly Hills. Before Denise could process what he'd said, John grabbed his arm and dragged him across the room. Hey, take your hands off me. But John ignored him. He yanked open the front door, and the two disappeared outside.
Chapter 4. John managed to keep himself from pitching the man down the steps. Take your hands off me, Miss Masters' ex-husband had made the demand, while attempting to free himself, more than once as John yanked him down the front steps and toward the driveway. This guy was strong, just not strong enough. John ignored him until they were beside the silver sedan. The sun was setting, though it wasn't even 4 o'clock yet, and the temperatures were already dropping, but John's anger kept him plenty warm. Coat yanked away again, and John let him go. He stumbled back and crashed into his car, barely keeping his feet. He turned and squared up with John like he was preparing for a fight. Don't make an enemy out of me. John kept his voice low and even. I need to talk to her. We need to figure this out. And I wasn't going to hurt her. My job is to keep Ms. Masters safe. The instant you suggested she return to the place where she's most likely to be murdered, you threatened her safety. His mouth opened, closed. I didn't. He ran a hand over his short hair. I didn't think of it that way. I just meant that she shouldn't be here. Every one of those murders happened in California. Your ex-wife just revealed to you that she might be a target, but it didn't occur to you. I get it. I'm trying to keep my daughter safe. This guy hasn't harmed any children. From what I've learned of the case, every victim has been an adult actress. A couple of them had children, but none of those children were harmed. Every murder occurred when the children weren't present. There is absolutely zero reason to believe your daughter might be a target. Her mother, on the other hand, okay, I see what you're saying, but she doesn't have to stay here. This is her house. She has more right to be on this property, he tapped his foot against the asphalt, than you do. You might not like that fact, but you can't argue it. Fine. He looked past John at the doorway. I'd like to go back inside and speak to her. Not tonight. Ask her. You don't get to decide. You can call her later and tell her what a brute I am. Right now, we need to manage her protection, and you're getting in the way. John reached past him and opened the car door. There was something else he needed to say before the guy left, though. You recognized me earlier. You were Josie Smith's bodyguard. I saw you at that 4th of July dinner, John said. There was one other time, but I doubt you saw me. It was the following Sunday at church. Coates' eyebrows hiked. John wasn't about to explain what had motivated the decision, the self-loathing that descended after his client had been kidnapped and almost killed, the desperate need to know that nobody's protection rested solely on his shoulders, that maybe there was a God who was watching, who was helping. Thomas and Josie had prayed a lot leading up to that terrible weekend. When they'd been taken, John had thought what a waste of time all that prayer had been. But they'd escaped. They'd both survived. It had been miraculous, which had sent him to church. You were at church that day, John said, standing next to your wife, your little girl between you. You had your hands up in the air like you were really into the music, like you were. Thomas and Josie almost died that weekend. I was thanking God. John considered that. I've been doing some studying about this faith thing. Here's what I'm trying to figure out. How can a guy who claims to be a Christian worship God like you did that day and still be so filled with hatred? Hatred directed at a woman he used to love, the mother of his child? He stepped closer, held his eye contact. Which is the real you? Are you a hypocrite or a liar? The man blinked and his shoulders drooped. I'm working on it. It's a process, this faith thing, as you call it. John backed off. I think you'd better step up that work. Ms. Masters is here, and she's not leaving. John was about to head inside when Lake spoke in his earpiece. Client wants to provide protection for her daughter, Lake said, and she's insisting I leave with the ex tonight, which would leave only John to protect Ms. Masters. He tapped the two-way at his hip. Bad idea. We need two here. Coates' eyebrows lifted, so John motioned to his earpiece. Bartlett says it's your call, Lake said. He's working on getting more manpower, but nobody can be up here until late. Just a few months earlier, John had almost gotten his client killed, and there'd been 2 guards on her that day, not to mention a station full of police officers. How could he keep Miss Masters safe by himself? What if he made another tactical error? I don't like it. Me either, but... Lake lowered her voice and he imagined her turning away so the client couldn't hear. She's stubborn. It's either she sends me with the ex or she sends us both away. He stifled a sigh. Prima donnas. Fine, John said. Meet you at the door. Keep her inside. He spoke to the ex. Don't leave yet. Told you she'd want to talk to me. Wrong again. He started back toward the house, coat at his side. Ms. Masters is insisting Lake go with you to protect your daughter. Rather than look relieved, the man seemed irritated. They were nearly to the steps when the door opened. The client stepped outside and John hopped up to stand in front of her, turning to face Reed. What part of keep her inside had Lake not understood? The actress clearly had no sense of the danger she was in. Is this really necessary? Ms. Masters asked from behind him. I'm trying to have a conversation. I'm trying to keep you alive. He positioned himself so she'd be able to see Reed, but would be hidden from the woods at the side of her house. If he were trying to kill her, that was where he'd hide, with his sniper rifle. Assuming the would-be killer had half a brain, Ms. Masters should be safe for now. He still didn't like it. After a long-suffering sigh, Ms. Masters spoke again. Lake is going with you, Reed. I guess there'll be a whole team, but the rest won't be here until tomorrow. I don't want that, Coates said. It'll freak Ella out. Ella will be fine. Her voice was patient, more than his would have been in a similar situation. I always have security when she's with me in California. If you just leave town, this isn't a negotiation, Miss Masters snapped. Then she started over in a calmer tone. I'm going to be at church tomorrow. Don't tell Ella. I want to surprise her. And then I'd like to bring her back here for the afternoon. Coates' jaw clenched so tight, John figured it was giving him a headache. I'd prefer more notice. You have something planned? That's not the point. The point is, she's my daughter too. Tension stretched between them. Ms. Masters didn't back down as Coates seemed to wrestle with his response. After a moment, he said, Fine, until dinner time. She has school on Monday. Thank you. Ms. Masters' voice was lower when she spoke again. Thanks for doing this. Though he couldn't see her, he assumed she was speaking to Lake. There's nothing more important to me than Ella. Lake jogged down the steps, giving John a look as she passed him. Yeah, he recognized that look. Lake was no happier about this plan than he was. Their number of clients had just doubled, more than doubled if he considered the ex and his wife, and Donnelly and Lake had to split up. A heap of papers inside the house underscored that Miss Masters was in danger, not to mention the attempt on her life that day. This was just getting better and better.
Chapter 5. They'd barely stepped back into the house when Denise's phone rang. The California number wasn't familiar, but she had a guess. Hello? Denise Masters? It was a man, his voice rough, like he smoked a lot of cigarettes or drank a lot of whiskey. Special Agent Martin Frank, California Bureau of Investigation. Agent? She eyed John beside her. He said low, Put it on speaker, please. She did, and they sat together at the kitchen table. You've spoken to Mr. Taggart? Agent Frank asked. First, let me tell you that my bodyguard is here with me. Donnelly, John said. I'm also a private investigator. We don't need any PIs involved. John glowered at the phone. Frank moved on. Miss Masters, did your agent send you the copy of the package he received? We have it here. Then you're up to speed. Any idea who might have left that for you? I'm sorry, I don't. Any fans bothering you lately? Strange fan mail? Bruce's office filters my mail for me. They don't forward anything they deem inappropriate. You can talk to them about. Did that, the special agent said. What about people lurking around your house? You live in Beverly Hills, right? Haven't noticed anybody unusual. I don't know if Bruce told you, but I'm not in California right now. But before you left, anybody new in your life? New neighbors? New friends? One name came to mind. There's my house sitter, Monroe Huxley. I know him from church. I've known him maybe 6 months, a year. So he's sort of a new friend, I guess. What can you tell me about him? He's a nice guy, a Christian, wants to be an actor. He's house sat for other actors and one of my neighbors, and they said he did a good job, so. Phone number? She found it and read it to him. Do you really think these murders are somehow related to me? Somebody left that package. John tapped her wrist, and she guessed he wanted to say something. She nodded for him to go ahead. Have you determined yet when the package was dropped off? No way to know, Frank said. The agency's rear lot is accessible by an alley that has no CCTV coverage. We've been studying the nearest cameras, but haven't picked up anyone carrying the envelope. Guy probably had it in a backpack or something. It could have been left before Shannon Butler's murder, or after, John clarified. Even if it was after, Frank said, we kept the story under wraps until nearly 6 a.m. If the person who dropped it is just a weird fan of murders and Miss Masters, he'd have to have learned about the murder, printed out the newspaper article, stuck it in an envelope, and dropped it off at Taggart's office, all before Taggart arrived at 7:30. And since he didn't print the Times article about the murder, but an earlier article. Got it, John said. Denise closed her eyes, letting the truth of what he was saying settle itself in her mind. Our working theory is that the killer left that packet, or it was somebody close enough to him to know who his next victim would be. An accomplice? John asked. Do you have reason to believe? No evidence he's working with somebody. Most serial killers work alone. Serial killers? How were they talking about a serial killer? A serial killer who'd singled out Denise. Why? Anything peculiar happened recently, Miss Masters? The agent asked. Weird, unusual, out of the ordinary? As if she didn't know the definition of peculiar. I can't think of anything. My life is pretty dull, to be honest. Oh, right. The poor, bored Hollywood starlet. Did she hear contempt in his voice? What was that about? John shot her a look and said, Somebody took a shot at her at the park today. Long range from a boat. What park? Where? Coventry, New Hampshire. Oh. The agent paused a moment. Any leads? Do the locals think it's related? We didn't know about the connection to the serial killer when the detective was here, John said. Yeah. Frank was quiet for a long moment. These killings have been going on for a year now, and none of them have involved shootings. They've all been up close and personal, thinking it's not related. Ms. Masters, maybe something from your past. Somebody with an obsessive attraction to you? Somebody who has something against you? Reed had something against her, but her ex-husband, as much as he hated her, wasn't violent. And anyway, he was here. The murders had happened in Los Angeles, and even Frank thought they were unrelated to the shooting that day. I've had my share of obsessive fans, Denise said. A few years ago, there was one guy who wrote me every single day, sent me gifts, expressed his undying love. I guessed he was pretty young, maybe even a teenager. Name? Bruce could tell you. What happened to him? Did you ask him to stop writing or? He just stopped one day. The letters came every day and then nothing. Just that one fan? Frank asked. That guy's letters got pretty graphic. That's when I started having Bruce and his team filter them for me. You'd have to ask him. John said, Detective, Did the murder victims receive similar packages with information about the previous murders? Should we be worried that Ms. Masters is this guy's next target? Should you be worried? Heck, yeah. But did they receive anything like this? He paused, probably for effect. They did not. What do you think it means? John asked. That's the million-dollar question. Miss Masters, can you think of anything you have in common with the victims? Besides the obvious, that we're all women actors living in California? No, can you? He ignored her question. Can you think of anything they have in common with each other? I'd only ever met one of them, she said. How would I know? There's some connection, Frank said. You must know something, and unless you're in favor of somebody killing off your competition, they're not my... I suggest you start talking. She started to toss out a retort, but once again, John's finger tapped her wrist. Apparently, he didn't want her to get into a confrontation with this guy. Or maybe he didn't see the point, and he wasn't wrong. Being in the public eye, Denise had gotten used to people worshiping her, admiring her, criticizing her, and loathing her. But those people didn't know the real her. She tried not to let their opinions, good or bad, affect her self-image. It wasn't as easy as it sounded. She kept her mouth shut. John didn't say anything either. They just let the agent's remark hang between them. Frank said, "It could be that whatever you're hiding is the connection to the other victims." "I'm not hiding anything," Denise said. "Could be something we haven't considered." "Could be," she said. "But since I have no idea what you have considered, I wouldn't know." John nodded as if he approved of her answer, though he didn't look her direction. "Anything in your past you'd prefer not be made public?" Of course there was. Everybody deserved a private life, didn't they? In Denise's case, her privacy was vital to signing her next contract. Did the victims have secrets in their past? Secrets that linked them? Hard to know since they're all dead. You're the only potential victim we've been able to interview. If I knew what kind of information you were looking for, anything somebody might kill over. She looked at John for help, but he was staring at the phone. Maybe glaring was the right word. "I'm sorry, Detective," she said, "but I don't know what to tell you. Are there things about my life I haven't made public?" "Of course. Aren't there things about your life you wouldn't want made public? But is there anything in my past worth killing over?" "Absolutely not." "It's possible you just don't know. If you gave me a hint about what kind of information you're looking for, I'd be happy to help you. Or do you just want me to tell you everything I've ever done?" "Wouldn't hurt." This was ridiculous. Agent Frank didn't speak for a long moment, and she certainly didn't have anything else to say. "If you think of anything..." "You'll keep us informed," John said, "and we'll do the same." "I expect you will. I'll be in touch." The call disconnected. She stared at the black screen, processing. John faced her. "Is there some connection you didn't want to tell him?" "There's a whole lot of stuff I wouldn't want to tell him. Tell anybody. But if I have a connection to the victims besides the obvious, then I'm not aware of it." He nodded. "If you think of anything that might connect you to even one of them..." "I have nothing to hide." Not entirely true, but she couldn't imagine how her secrets, which were relatively tame, considering the trouble a lot of actors got into, had anything to do with the murders. Denise didn't want to think about that anymore. It wasn't as if she could solve the crimes, and she'd come to New Hampshire to get away from all that madness. It was time for dinner. Time to shift her attention to something less disturbing. She stood and scoured the cabinets for ingredients. She was no gourmet, but she liked to cook. Back in California, she fixed dinner for herself a couple of times a week. Nights she didn't cook, she usually had meals delivered. People who didn't know any better figured a so-called movie star would have friends galore and invitations every night. Maybe other people did, and Denise used to, but now she spent the majority of evenings at home by herself. Most of her friendships had proved to be pretty shallow over the years, people who loved her for her position and money. She liked the people she worked with, other actors on the set, even the professionals who worked backstage, but she mostly saw them during filming. Usually, if she socialized at all, it was with friends from church, but most of them were married with children. Though she knew she could count on them in a crisis, they lived busy lives. She'd had one good friend who'd moved with her to LA 8 years before, but after Brittany tried for years to break into the movie business and failed, she'd moved back to New Hampshire. Denise had come home to establish a relationship with her daughter. She'd also come to rekindle old friendships. She and Cassidy kept up, and Cassidy had convinced her she would be accepted in her friend group, even by Reed's wife, Jackie. But had she brought a killer with her? She found a recipe on her laptop, browned the meat, drained the fat, and added the rest of the ingredients while John pored over the articles spread across her dining room table. The man was too quiet. It was disconcerting. And shouldn't he be standing at a door? She'd never known a private security guard to investigate. She'd have to ask him about that. Once the taco soup was simmering, Denise started a fire in the fireplace, something she'd rarely gotten to do in California, then ran upstairs to change. John, and the rest of the bodyguards, would have to get used to seeing her in cozy loungewear. She wasn't going to walk around in skinny jeans and fancy blouses in her own home. She puttered in her bedroom for a while, unpacking some of the boxes she'd had shipped from California, and those filled with clothes she'd ordered online. Warm sweaters and boots she had little need for back in LA. Mostly, she was avoiding the man downstairs. It had been strange earlier to have the two bodyguards. With just John, it was beyond awkward. Not that he wasn't attractive. He was, very. He was the quintessential strong soldier type, broad and barrel-chested, the kind of guy who could star in a Navy SEAL movie or something. But it wasn't his looks that drew her. His protectiveness tweaked a desire she'd let go dormant a long time before. It had been years since she'd had a man, had anybody take care of her. She liked it, which was ridiculous. He was a bodyguard, paid to protect her. His care for her was no less mercenary than her agent's. Maybe she should give up her dream of forming real relationships and hire a few friends while she was at it. Anyway, John didn't seem to like her. She was used to people fawning over her, not scowling at her. When she figured the soup had simmered long enough to be palatable, she returned downstairs. John was still hunched over the papers on the kitchen table. He was making notes on a pad of paper, but looked up when she scooted around the bar into the kitchen. She waited for some comment, about her clothes, about the scents coming from the stovetop, but he said nothing, just returned to his work. Anything interesting? She removed the soup pot from the heat and stirred. Just familiarizing myself with the case. He didn't even glance her way when he spoke. And again, she was struck by how different this man was from most she met. If he found her the least bit attractive, he was a master at hiding it. Most men looked longer than they needed to. This guy seemed utterly unaffected, which was good. The last thing she needed was to fend off advances from people staying at her house. That'd be a great way for John to get himself fired. Were you hired to investigate or protect me? Both. He looked up, caught her staring, and returned his attention to the papers. She swiveled to the refrigerator and pulled out an avocado, a block of cheddar, and sour cream. She set to work slicing the avocado, then grating the cheese. What else? She returned to the pantry and found a bag of tortilla chips. Back in the kitchen, she asked, "You hungry?" This time when he looked at her, he wore a polite smile. "If you don't mind, it smells delicious." Pleasure warmed her cheeks. Ridiculous. "Of course. We can eat at the bar so you don't have to move all that stuff." He stood. "Can I help?" "There are bowls around here somewhere." She waved at the cabinets. "You find them, and I'll see if I can locate napkins." She searched the pantry to no avail. She headed back to the kitchen. "We're going to have to—" "Found them." He held them up. She moved the soup pot to the wide bar, beside the fixings, then spun to survey the kitchen. She sang, "He chuckled, the sound deep and warm, and her cheeks burned for the second time in 3 minutes. What was wrong with her? She knew, though. She always fought awkwardness with humor, or tried to, anyway. He snatched one from a drawer, then grabbed 2 spoons. "How is it that I know your kitchen better than you do?" More observant, Better memory. I have an excellent memory for lines in a script, and very little else. She scooped about a half a cup of soup into a bowl, added avocado slices, a tiny dollop of sour cream, and 2 crunched-up tortilla chips. I don't have a lot to drink. Lemonade, it's Ella's favorite, and flavored water. Plain water's fine. She fixed 2 glasses while John filled his soup bowl, then piled sour cream and cheddar on top. He stuck a handful of chips in another bowl and slid the whole thing to the opposite side of the bar. Are you going to have enough there? She stared at a week's worth of calories. He eyed her smaller portion, then lifted one eyebrow. Are you? I'm trying to keep my figure. You're doing a fine job. That earned a look. This time, it was John's cheeks turning red. She barely suppressed a laugh, instead digging into her dinner. He did the same. They ate in silence for a couple of minutes. She nodded with her chin to the table adjacent to them. So, what did you learn? Just looking for patterns? And? Probably didn't see anything the cops haven't already seen, and they have more information than I do. Victims are all between 25 and 40, all women, and all relatively successful actors. At least I'd call them successful, would you? She recalled what she'd read of them. Most of them, yes. It seems at least one hadn't worked in a while, but she'd been successful. Enough to be called starlets, she scoffed. That's a silly term. He wagged his head back and forth. I guess. You Hollywood people? That is not a Hollywood term. We're actors, professionals. A starlet sounds like some prissy puffed-up prima donna. He smiled and looked away. What? This is really good. Do all starlets know how to cook? She scowled at him, and he laughed. It was strange sharing a meal in her kitchen with a man she'd just met, in New Hampshire, talking like normal people. A half hour before, she'd wondered if he even liked her. She'd guessed now that maybe he did, at least a little. The thought warmed her as much as the fire crackling in the fireplace. She couldn't remember the last time she'd enjoyed a bowl of soup so much. And seriously, how pathetic was that? Chapter 6. Denise couldn't help a jubilant feeling as she settled into the back seat of the bodyguard's SUV the following day. She'd wanted to drive herself to church, but this guy was as stubborn as John. The changing of the guard had happened at some point after Denise had gone to bed. The new guy, older than John by at least a decade and built like a Hummer, was even less chatty than her dinner companion the night before. And that was saying something. She glanced at her watch, afraid they might be late. But there was plenty of time. The little charm hanging from the chain wristband caught her eye, and she lifted it. It was a circle, so small it could easily be a logo tag. John had given it to her the night before. It had some sort of tracking device in it. Just in case we lose you. Not that we will, but I've learned to be prepared. She wasn't sure how she felt about being tracked, but she hadn't been able to come up with any reason why it wasn't a good idea. A trip to church ought to be safe enough. She'd been tempted to wait until the service started and slip in the back, but she had as much right to be there as anybody else. Why should she hide? So, she'd texted Jackie that morning. The woman was much more polite than Reed, and asked if she'd please save a seat for her. Jackie had responded immediately. Happy to. We usually sit in the third pew from the front on the right side, so you can come down the side aisle if you want. Ella is going to be thrilled to see you. Denise appreciated her ex-husband's wife. She seemed a little on the shy side, but she was kind and genuine, and she was good to Ella. And maybe Denise could admit a little jealously, not because Jackie was married to Reed, but because of the relationship she had with Ella. But that was Denise's problem, not Jackie's. They pulled up to the door of the old white church a couple of blocks from the lake in downtown Coventry, and the bodyguard walked her inside while another parked the car. There were 4 of them that morning. Overkill if she'd ever seen it. But the conversations from the night before were fresh. As if the Starlet Slayer weren't enough, there had been the shooter at the park. Surely the Starlet Slayer couldn't be in Coventry, right? Even John had seemed skeptical when she'd floated that idea. But it was either that, or there were 2 killers out there, one of whom might even know where she lived. which meant he probably knew about her connection to Ella, which meant her daughter was in danger. The night before, she'd considered leaving Coventry. She was not willing to risk Ella's safety for anything, but John had talked her off that ledge. It's very likely that the shooter is a local, and if he is, he already knows Ella is your daughter, which means she's no more and no less in danger now than she was before you came. With 2 full security teams, we can keep you both safe. She'd allowed herself to believe him, maybe because he was right, maybe because she wanted to stay. The church had changed in the years since she'd been there. They'd built an addition that connected the sanctuary to the classroom building adjacent to it, and most people entered the doors into that addition. The bodyguards had parked outside the main entrance, though, so she entered through the wide double doors, the way she had as a child. When she stepped inside, the familiar sense hit her, a musty combination of old books and dust and age. She wanted nothing more than to stop and take it in, but the man at her elbow urged her forward, skirting most of the crowd. "Find your seat, ma'am. Try not to stand out." Despite her profession, in recent years she'd done her best not to stand out. Didn't often succeed. The service hadn't begun yet, and people streamed into the foyer from the long hallway to the left. Some recognized her. She knew by the way their eyes widened in surprise, but most paid her no mind. Denise pretended she was just another parishioner, pretended there wasn't an oversized bodyguard at her side, eyeing everybody with suspicion, and followed the crowd into the worship center. She'd always loved this building, the pretty stained glass windows, the sloping ceiling, the dark podium on the stage, and the simple cross that hung behind it. There was nothing ostentatious or ornate about the church, and yet she'd always felt close to God here. If only she and Reed had kept coming through college. If only they hadn't let their faith slip away when they'd sacrificed their purity on the altar of desire. Maybe everything would be different now. Denise wouldn't be a successful actor, but she'd give all that up to have the years back. The time with her daughter, even the marriage. Not that she wanted Reed now, but they could have made it work. They could have been happy. Maybe that other life would have been better, maybe not. That was the thing about regret. You looked back and assumed different decisions would have been better decisions, which would have led to a better life. But maybe different decisions would have only led to a different life, one with just as many trials and troubles. Regret was pointless. She was forgiven. God was good. Sometimes it was that simple. She rounded the pews and walked down the aisle on the far right to the 3rd row, where Reed and Jackie were standing and talking to a couple in front of them. Reed was smiling, even laughing. She hadn't seen that side of him in many years. Jackie's baby bump was pronounced beneath the fitted top, and Denise felt a sharp pang of jealousy. No, she didn't want Reed, but she did want what Jackie had found. A man who loved her, a beautiful, precious little girl who lived under her roof, and a child on the way. All that mattered now was the little girl sitting on the pew, drawing on a notepad, while her legs swung beneath the wooden seat. Denise scooted in to stand beside her. She kept her voice low and leaned down to her level. "Surprise!" Ella glanced her way, then looked again, brown eyes as wide as quarters. "Mommy!" Unlike Denise, she made no attempt to keep her voice low. She scrambled to her feet and launched herself into Denise's arms. Denise lifted her daughter, whose little legs curled around her waist like she was 4, not 8, and fought a wave of tears. How had she ever left this child? Regret might be pointless, but sometimes it was as real as the girl in her arms, and twice as heavy. "What are you doing here?" Denise leaned away so she could look into her daughter's face. Her skin was milky white, showing off the faint freckles on her nose. Her lips were rosy red and stretched into a smile. She'd grown since Denise had seen her. Every time she held this precious child of hers, she was struck by how much she was missing. Not anymore. She wouldn't miss any more of Ella's life. But it was too soon to say that. One step at a time. "I came to see you." "How long are you staying?" "I'll be here at least through Christmas." Ella's eyes widened even more. "Christmas? That's a whole month away." She released her legs from around Denise's waist and stepped onto the pew again, facing her father. "Daddy, look!" Reed turned from his conversation, saw Denise over Ella's head. His easy smile slid away, replaced with the tight, polite one he always wore when he was looking at Denise, and Ella was watching. He shifted his focus to his daughter. "What a fun surprise. Did you know she was coming?" "She asked me not to tell." "It's the best surprise ever." Reed pressed a finger over his lips. "Let's use our inside voice, okay?" "Sorry, Daddy." She turned back to Denise, beaming. The music started, and Denise held Ella's hand and sang along with the worship music, trying and failing to focus on God. Seemed Ella was having the same trouble, because every time Denise glanced at her daughter, she was looking back, love and joy in her expression, making Denise's heart expand. She wasn't worthy of Ella's love. She wasn't worthy of God's either, but she had it. And his forgiveness. She didn't deserve the righteousness he said was hers, the freedom from shame. She'd learned that she had to embrace God's promises and believe them before she could experience them. She had to trust his promises despite her feelings. She was learning. With Ella at her side, it was easy to believe in a God who loved her. What else would explain the love of a precious little girl directed at a woman as unworthy as herself? In the back seat of the bodyguard's SUV, Ella bounced at Denise's side. "I can't believe you're really here. This is the best surprise ever." "Daddy didn't say anything, and Jackie either. I saw the black car and all the people, but Daddy said to ignore them." "Are they bodyguards too? Why are they at our house? Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" "I wanted to surprise me, I know, and it was awesome. Where are we going?" "Oh my gosh, I'm in a school play. Maybe you could come, would you? That would be so cool. I don't remember when it is, though. Not for a couple weeks, I think. Jackie would know. I'll ask her." "I'd love to see it." Denise's smile was so wide, her cheeks were starting to hurt. "Is this your car? Are these your normal bodyguards?" "Not exactly." Denise had never told her daughter that she only had bodyguards when Ella visited. She'd never been that concerned about her own safety. "What are we going to do today? Can we get pizza?" "If you want." That wasn't Denise's plan, but she didn't want to disappoint her daughter. "Maybe we could go to that place in town." In the front seat, the bodyguard cleared his throat. "Smitty," she remembered. She caught his expression in the rearview mirror. He shook his head. Not that he got to decide how Denise spent her time, but she understood his concern. "You know what?" Denise said. "If you want pizza, we can have it delivered. But I have another surprise for you first." She hoped, prayed, Ella would be more excited than her father had been. Before, when Denise came to town, she'd stayed in one of the little hotels downtown. It wasn't the nicest place in the world, but at least the innkeeper didn't judge her life choices the way her parents did. And anyway, she'd never stayed very long. Normally, Ella visited her in California. Denise only came here when she had a break in her schedule, and the longing to see her daughter was so strong that she couldn't wait for their next planned visit. Reed hated it when she popped in like that, always telling Denise how her visits disrupted his daughter's routine, as if Denise had no claim on her. He was amicable as long as Denise stayed in the box he'd built for her, on the West Coast, only visiting after gaining his expressed permission. He was probably cursing her even now as he drove home from church. Would he see the irony in that? "What surprise?" Ella asked. "You'll just have to wait and see." The bodyguard wound up Rattlesnake Road, another bodyguard at his side. They followed an SUV with 2 more guards in it, and another followed with 3 more. Ella's team and Denise's team would both be available to protect them when they were together. Denise was so glad she'd had the pool house built. There'd been a detached garage on the property, but for some reason, its foundation had been destroyed. She'd had a fresh foundation poured, this one larger. The 2-car garage was still there, but now there was also a small apartment with 2 bedrooms. She hadn't furnished it yet, but John had assured her he'd get some air mattresses for the team. It would be their headquarters as long as she needed protection. Ella kept up a stream of chatter until the bodyguards pulled into the driveway. The house wasn't huge, but it was charming, especially pretty against the backdrop of pine trees that surrounded it. There was a black SUV, seemed the bodyguards had an endless supply, and a white van that hadn't been there earlier. It had the words White Mountain Security on the side. John had told her he'd be upgrading her security system. He hadn't wasted any time. Ella had quieted beside her. "Where are we?" Denise didn't answer right away. She waited until the bodyguard parked and opened the door for her. She stepped out, and Ella scrambled behind her. Denise took the child's hand in hers and gazed up at the two-story structure. "Do you like it?" "It's pretty," Ella said. "Do you know the people who live here?" Denise smiled down at her daughter. "I do, and so do you." "Ma'am." The bodyguards had gathered beside and behind. "We should get inside." "1 second." Denise crouched down. "I bought this house, love. It's mine." Ella's eyes got wide again and her jaw dropped. "It's yours? You live here?" "I still have my place in LA," she said quickly, "but I'm going to try to spend as much time here." Ella threw herself into her arms, cutting off Denise's words. Emotion pricked her eyes. When she backed up so she could see her daughter's face, she saw tears streaming down her little cheeks, and her own fell. "I didn't mean to make you cry." "I'm not crying," Ella said through her tears. "I'm happy." "Me too." "Ma'am," the man said again. "Inside, please." Denise straightened and took Ella's hand, and they walked with the throng of bodyguards. The one who seemed to be in charge opened the door for her, and she and Ella stepped inside. He didn't. None of them did, just let them go in alone. Denise appreciated that more than she could express. Ella froze in the entrance and took in the room. Her gaze didn't get farther than the Christmas tree in the corner. "It's ginormous! I was hoping you'd help me decorate it today." The joy on her daughter's face filled Denise's heart with praise. "Thank you for this, Lord. I don't deserve her. Help me do right by her, and please keep her safe."
Chapter 7. John had stayed alert and on guard until after 2 a.m., when reinforcements arrived, at which point he left to try to get some sleep. Ms. Masters had suggested he and his team use the little apartment in the building out back, and they'd gotten the heat on early enough that the place had been decently warm by the time he'd made it out there. It had no furniture, so he'd slept on the floor with blankets she'd pulled off one of the extra beds in the main house. He'd already ordered some blow-up mattresses and bedding. The boss had sent 10 guards to join John and Lake. They would sleep in shifts, all of them in that little house out back. Fortunately, the Coates only lived a few miles away. John had awakened just after the team left with Ms. Masters for church. He'd been tempted to join them, but he trusted his co-workers to keep her safe. Instead, he'd contacted an alarm company and arranged for them to come to the house immediately to set up a top-quality security system. They were on the property now, putting cameras all around the perimeter. A security fence would be installed on Monday. Mr. Taggart had told them to spare no expense in protecting their client. It was amazing the service money could buy. While they worked, John had dug more into the starlet slayings, gathering as much intelligence as he could from the internet and his sources in law enforcement. He didn't know anybody in the CBI, but he did have a friend in the FBI who'd promised to find out what he could. Since all the murders had taken place in California, there was no federal element to it, so the FBI wasn't technically involved. But they had resources. His friend would be able to learn more than John could. What he'd discovered so far hadn't exactly soothed his worries. The first victim had been stabbed when she'd gone for a walk in her Brentwood neighborhood. At the time, the police had thought it was a random attack. The second victim had been at her beach house in Malibu. She'd gone for an early morning jog. Her husband had found her body floating on the tide a couple of hours later. She'd also been stabbed. It wasn't until the third victim, a month later, that the police linked the murders. She'd been filming on location in San Francisco, had only stepped away for a few minutes to take a call. While her friends and co-workers ran through the scene just a few yards distant, she was stabbed in the heart. It was then that the reporter first dubbed the murderer the Starlet Slayer. Some of the most famous and wealthiest female actors in Hollywood hired bodyguards. Others wouldn't leave the house without a companion. Studios paid drivers to take their stars back and forth to work. Upscale neighborhoods put together teams to patrol. For 3 months, nothing happened. And then the fourth victim. She'd had bodyguards. She'd been careful not to leave her house alone, but she'd thought she was safe behind the walls of her property. She'd been wrong. Her body was found floating in her own pool, face down. All the victims had been stabbed, but the circumstances had been different with every murder. The killer had hidden in the back seat of one victim's car, stabbed her in the neck from behind. He'd killed another after breaking into her home. The latest, Shannon Butler, despite her bodyguards, had been murdered in the bathroom at a swanky restaurant. The killer was getting more daring, and for some reason he'd sent Ms. Masters information on his victims. Why? At the sound of cars in the driveway, John bundled up the paperwork he'd been poring over and put it away. He'd done a final sweep of the house when Grant told him they were leaving the church. Now he stood against the back wall as Ms. Masters and her daughter stepped in. The girl was beautiful, like her mother, and though she had tear streaks on her cheeks, she seemed happy. Ms. Masters took her on a tour of the house, starting upstairs, then down the hall to the office and bathroom, then into the kitchen. "This is Mr. Donnelly," Ms. Masters said. "John, my daughter Ella." The girl looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. He couldn't blame her. Everything about him was oversized. His left leg probably weighed more than this little bird. He crouched down and held out his hand. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Miss Coate." She giggled. "Only Mrs. Brooks calls me that. She's my teacher, and when she gets mad at you, she calls you by your last name." "I can't imagine anybody getting mad at you," John said. The child giggled again, a beautiful sound. "Only when I talk too much. Not like Jansen. He's always in trouble. He likes to pull hair and push people." "Is he a bully?" Ella se encogió de hombros. "I guess a little." John glanced at Ms. Masters' face long enough to see the concern there. "If he ever pushes you around," he said, "you let me know. I'll have a talk with him." Ella's grin stretched across her face. "I bet you'd scare the mean right out of him." John couldn't help but smile. If only the mean were that simple to scare out of adults. Ms. Masters tugged her daughter's hand, and they started for the door beneath the stairs. "I'm going to show you the basement. There's a special room down here you can run to if you ever get scared of anything." John had discovered the basement apartment the night before after Ms. Masters went to bed. It had a bedroom, a bathroom, and a living area that included a small kitchen. If the door to enter hadn't been hidden behind a wall of shelves, he'd never have known it was a panic room. But the door and jamb were made of reinforced steel. Someone had already installed electronic locks. He'd make sure that both a wired phone and a satellite phone were kept behind that door. By the time he and the company he'd hired were finished, it would be a perfect panic room, the kind of place a person could hole up safely for days. Strange thing to build into a home in a vacation town in New Hampshire, but he wasn't complaining. Ms. Masters and Ella returned after a few minutes and retrieved a couple of boxes from the office. He'd noticed the stack the night before, so he went down the hall and grabbed the rest. He set them in the living room, where Ms. Masters was already digging into one that looked old and worn. "These are my favorite ornaments," she said. Ella pulled out a bundle of tissue paper and unwrapped it, then beamed. It was a little foam reindeer with Google eyes and a drawn-on face. "I made this." "I know, that's why I love it." John watched as mother and daughter unpacked, sometimes laughing at ornaments Ella had made over the years. When Ella suggested the one shaped like a tiny hand and scribbled all over was too ugly for that pretty tree, Miss Masters pressed it to her chest lovingly. "Don't say that about my favorite one." "That can't be, Mommy. It's horrible." "You made it when you were 2 years old. It's a treasure, just like you." Ella beamed. Now, Miss Masters might not have been the girl's custodial parent, but she seemed to not only know her daughter very well, but to adore her and connect with her. When there was a break in the conversation, he cleared his throat. "Ms. Masters, I saw a ladder in the garage last night. Want me to bring it in?" "Call me Denise, please," she said. "Would you mind? That would be so helpful." Denise. He preferred to keep things professional, but he wouldn't say so now. "Not a problem." After he set the ladder up beside the tree, he returned to the kitchen and tried not to watch as mother and daughter covered it with ornaments. Christmas music played in the background, and when Ella wasn't chattering, they sang along. Ella was filling a tiny area of the tree, stacking the decorations on top of each other, But her mother never said a word, just worked around her. She'd purchased boxes of glittery balls and ornaments of every shape and color, and within a few minutes the bottom half of the tree was heavily laden. John wished he could give them privacy, but he wasn't comfortable leaving them alone. Instead, he took out the paperwork he'd been perusing earlier, leaving it on the counter away from where Ella might see, and looked again for patterns. It was surreal, reading about murders while Let It Snow played in the background. It was past noon when John heard a voice in his ear. "Car pulling in," Grant said. John moved to the front window to look, prepared to usher Ms. Masters and Ella to the basement. But a moment later, Grant spoke again. "Guy says she ordered pizza." "I'll check." He cleared his throat, but neither mother nor child paid him any attention. He turned down the music, and Ms. Masters' voice lingered after the song faded. "We're in a winter wonderland." She turned to him. "Oh, now you know what a terrible singing voice I have." Ella said, "Mommy, you have the prettiest voice in the whole wide world." The girl obviously loved her mother because that was not true. He fought a smile. "Ma'am." She glowered at him. Was she trying to be intimidating? Because it was more cute than anything. "Ms. Masters, did you?" "I told you to call me Denise." This wasn't the time to argue that point. "Did you order pizza?" "Yay, it's here." Ella jumped and bolted to the front door. She almost got it open, but John beat her to it and pressed his hand against it above her head. He leaned down. "Can you let me open it, please? And maybe you can go stand with your mommy?" Ms. Masters called, "Come on, baby. Help me get out plates and napkins." The child skipped away, utterly unconcerned. To John, Miss Masters said, "I already paid and tipped him." "Great." John opened the door to find Grant standing on the stoop with not one pizza box, but 8? She'd ordered 8 pizzas? He took the stack and carried it to the kitchen. "Hungry?" She settled a stack of paper plates and napkins on the bar. "Obviously, I ordered enough for you and your team." When he set them down, she opened lids, filling the room with the scents of pepperoni and sausage and onions and tomato sauce, until she came to one that had no toppings but cheese. "Grab yourself a few slices of whatever you like and take the rest to your friends." She slid slices onto 2 plates and carried them to the table. "Go wash your hands, love. You want lemonade or water?" "Lemonade, please!" Ella dashed past him to the hallway. The bathroom door slammed behind her. "What can I get you to drink?" she asked. "I have water," he said. When she didn't look up, he said, "Ma'am?" She was filling glasses with ice. "John, please don't call me ma'am." He took a deep breath. "Ms. Masters." She poured water into one glass and lemonade into the other before facing him. Her brows lowered. "What's wrong?" "2 things, actually 3 things." She crossed her arms. "Go ahead." 1, you need to let us know when you're expecting company or a delivery so we can be prepared. "I can do that." 2, I stocked the refrigerator in your guest house with food. We can feed ourselves. "Are you offended by pizza?" "What? No." She must have seen something in his expression he didn't mean to convey. "We appreciate the pizza. I'm sure we'll devour every slice. I just want you to understand that you don't have to feed us. That's not your responsibility." "But if I want to, I can, right?" "I mean, yeah, I guess, but..." "And 3, call me Donnelly. Nobody calls me John." Her eyebrows hiked. "Nobody?" "Well, my parents, my sisters." Me, he thought, but he didn't say that. "But otherwise..." "Your co-workers call you Donnelly?" "They do." "Your friends?" Most of his friends were co-workers or old comrades from the army. They all called him Donnelly. "Do you not have close friendships?" she asked. "You and I are not friends, Miss Masters. I work for you." "Denise." "Miss Masters. And I'm Donnelly." If he wasn't mistaken, and he had to be mistaken, didn't he? He would have sworn he saw hurt cross her expression. Before she could say anything else, Ella returned to the room and practically dove into her chair. "Cheese, my favorite." Ms. Masters joined her daughter at the table, ending their discussion. He opened the pizza boxes until he found one covered with meat and slid 4 slices onto a paper plate, then radioed Grant to come get the rest, leaving only the remaining cheese pizza in the house. Hopefully, he and Miss Masters had come to an understanding. He was there to keep her safe and help figure out who was threatening her. He was not there to be her friend. If only he could wipe that look of hurt from his memory,